and that is preparing for the next pandemic. I've been rereading Jared Diamond's book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. And he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal a few months ago about the current infectious disease. He said the most different thing about COVID-19 is not that it's more infectious, but the jet plane is what is different about this disease. That it can spread instantly from Wuhan to San Francisco to Nashville to Boston, and that the next pandemic could be next year. So we had a hearing about preparing for the next pandemic, and people like Bill Frist, who was majority leader 20 years ago, said, we keep trying to do things to prepare for the next pandemic, but we go, in Dr. Tom Frieden's words, from panic to neglect to panic. In other words, while we're in the middle of a pandemic, it's got our attention, but as soon as it's over, we don't do all the things that we should do. So my hope is that with any action that we take this year, we would include the 3 or 4 things that we should take to make sure that we sustain funding, which is the hardest thing to do. How do you fund for more than 1 year? For onshore manufacturing of vaccines, for example, for stockpiles that were depleted between vaccines, for making sure that FEMA and Dr. Cadlett's organization are aligned properly and operating together. Dr. Redfield's talk about, and Mike Leavitt did to our committee, the former governor of Utah, that we've been underfunding public health for 30 or 40 years. I think it's important we do it this year. And so in the Republican bill that we offered last week, we did have in there some authorization from our committee to fund onshore manufacturing and continuous funding of stockpiles so they would be full. And I would just like for our committee to give that the same kind of attention, the subcommittee, that we gave, for example, to funding for NIH, because it will take some sort of mandatory funding or advance appropriation, as this subcommittee did under Senator Gregg a few years ago for BioShield. It's not a lot of money. I think what we suggested was $500 million a year for 10 years for onshore manufacturing. Why is that important? In 2012, we created 3 manufacturing plants just for this purpose, but 2 of them, as in Governor Leavitt's words, went cold, and they weren't available instantly to do what we needed done. And the 3rd one had a hard time finding anything to do between pandemics. So we need some funding for it. And then for stockpiles got depleted at the federal level, in hospitals, in states, because of budget cuts. And so we weren't ready for what we needed to be ready for. And then public health funding is a separate one. BioShield is another one. So I think we're not talking about lots of money. What we're talking about is different, is sustained funding for a period of years. Now, Dr. Cadleck, I've taken most of my time, but would you comment on that? And precisely in the ideal world, what should we do now to prepare for the next pandemic, which Jared Diamond says might be next year?
Well, thank you very much, Senator Alexander, and I agree entirely with your proposition that we do need to make investments over the long term, that we need to look at this problem as a national security problem as it is a public health problem. We lose on a day, a given day.
Yeah, but what are the specific things? We got about 30 seconds.
Sir, manufacturing, domestic manufacturing for biologics and vaccines. We also basically need to have a capacity to basically manage those stockpiles effectively through both commercial and state-level processes. And we need to probably require hospitals and other healthcare institutions to have some baseline level of preparedness and stockpiles.
So we need to keep the stockpiles full. Are we talking about a lot of money?
No, sir. I think in your bill you've identified about $2 billion. I think that's where you start. And then again, most of these items are common use, used anyway daily in hospital use and healthcare use, and just maintaining that stockpile over time. But it does require a business model to support that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator.